All right, so I got a pretty big update here for you guys on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, as President Joseph Robinette Biden has been facing some pretty significant backlash for his decision to send cluster munitions or cluster bombs over to Ukraine to use in their ongoing defensive efforts. So here from the Washington Post, just on some of the basics, they say Biden approves cluster munition supply to Ukraine. So what are they talking about here? They say President Biden has approved the provision of U.S. cluster munitions for Ukraine, with drawdown of the weapons from the Defense Department stocks due to be announced on Friday. They say the move, which will bypass U.S. law prohibiting the production, use, or transfer of cluster munitions for pretty good reason, as we're going to see here in a minute, with a failure rate of more than 1%. Honestly, I think that is a drastic underselling of the amount of so-called duds that are typically within these cluster munitions, but they claim a failure rate of more than 1%, and this comes amid concerns about Kyiv's lagging counter-offensive against entrenched Russian troops and dwindling Western stocks of conventional artillery. So it looks like basically the claim that they're making is like, we're running a little bit low on some of our other forms of artillery shells, or whatever the case may be, that we were sending over to Ukraine to use in their ongoing war effort, and so we are sort of resorting to this so that we don't further deplete our own stockpiles, or I guess maybe give us time to ramp up the production of other weapons that could be used. I mean, that sort of says a couple of different things about the current status of the U.S. military. I mean, obviously we have a multi-billion-dollar military-industrial complex, weapons, defense, manufacturing base here in the U.S. that is profiting greatly off of this war. It seems like we're basically sort of feeling as if Ukraine is almost sort of failing in their counter-offensive, at least not getting the gains that they otherwise would have hoped for. And so now we are resorting to using these kinds of weapons, which have typically been banned within modern warfare because of their destructive capabilities, because of their risk to civilians. And now they're sort of like stepping over that line and saying, we are going to start using some of these cluster bombs, which is something that even Russia has used in the past, and that they have been criticized by Western forces, including the United States and the Biden administration themselves, as even going so far as to call them war crimes. So we'll get to a clip of that here in a second. But I mean, again, it kind of is not giving you a great indication in terms of the current status of the Ukrainian defensive effort that they are resorting to using these kinds of ammunitions. But they continue here. They say it follows months of internal administrative debate over whether to supply the controversial munitions, which are banned by most countries in the world. I will leave it to you guys to guess which countries are not in accordance with that ban on cluster bombs. Actually, we're going to get to that here in a second, so take your guesses now, I guess. But they say cluster weapons explode in the air over a target, releasing dozens to hundreds of smaller submunitions across a wide area. And they say more than 120 countries have joined a convention banning their use as inhumane and indiscriminate, in large part because of the high failure rates that litter the landscape with unexploded submunitions that endanger both friendly troops and civilians, often for decades after the end of the conflict. They say the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, okay, so most of the major players in this war, which is alleged to have used them extensively in Ukraine, are not parties to the convention. They say 8 of NATO's 31 members, including the U.S., have not ratified the convention. So, I mean, obviously, we should be, signatories to this convention. We should not be selling or giving these cluster bombs to any country, whether or not that's for some sort of like a noble defensive effort, or whether it's for some sort of an imperialist war, or whatever the case may be. These things are going to inevitably kill civilians, right? And there have been some estimates, depending on the historical context you want to point to, depending on the country you want to point to, whether it's like Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam, that the United States has used these munitions before throughout the past. I mean, you can look at data and it says that a vast majority of the casualties from cluster bombs are actually civilians, okay? Innocent men, women, and children, disproportionately children, because they may be, wandering into different places that these things have been duds and have fallen into certain areas, and then they end up stumbling upon them, and then they lose limbs, or they end up, unfortunately dying. And so that is the result of what this type of weapon is typically used for. So now let's go ahead and jump into Joe Biden with Fareed Zakaria on his justification for why he is deciding to make this decision here. So let's just go ahead and jump into this clip here real quick.
What made you change your mind and decide to give them these weapons?
Two things, Fareed, and it was a very difficult decision on my part. And by the way, I discussed this with our allies, discussed this with our friends up on the Hill. And we're in a situation where Ukraine continues to be brutally attacked across the board by munitions, by these cluster munitions that have dud rates that are very, very low, very high, that are a danger to civilians, number one. Number two, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The ammunition, they call them 155 millimeter weapons. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did, took the recommendation of the Defense Department to, not permanently, but to allow for, in this transition period where we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians, to provide them with something that has a very low dud rate. It's about I think it's 150, which is the least likely to be blowing, and it's not used in civilian areas. They're trying to get through those trenches and then stop those tanks from rolling. And so...
Okay. So, a couple of different things there. First of all, the dud rate, again, that he mentions there is pretty dubious, to say the least. I mean, basically, it seems like he's claiming, like, well, when Russia uses these, they have, like, a, multiple times larger dud rate within the munitions that they're using versus the ones we're using. Maybe that could be true, I guess, hypothetically, but I also have seen some contradictory reporting showing that the Defense Department, the Biden administration, are sort of, like, lying about the actual dud rate of the, the munitions that are being sent over to Ukraine. So that's one aspect of it. Another part of this that stood out to me is him claiming that these aren't going to be used in civilian areas, which just doesn't really make sense at all, because, like, sure, Ukraine is not going to be using these in the city center of Kyiv or something like that, but they are using these on Russian positions, and Russian positions are currently in what Ukraine claims to be their territory, rightfully so, and that presumably would be territory that, in the best case scenario in their eyes, civilians would eventually return to. So, I mean, again, we have historical examples, whether it's in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc., where decades and decades later, people are still being killed or, horrifically maimed by these types of cluster bombs, right? So this is something that is going to last into the future, something that today you're saying is not a civilian, area, in the future could very well be a place where some innocent kid stumbles upon it and ends up getting killed. So, I mean, that part of it just makes absolutely no, sense in my mind whatsoever. I don't think that Joe Biden's justification there makes any sense in my head, at least, and it especially doesn't make sense when you take into consideration things like this. I mean, this is Jen Psaki, his former, press spokeswoman, who was basically calling out Russia for using these same exact types of munitions and even calling them war crimes. Okay, so let's watch this real quick.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime. Obviously, there are a range of international fora that would.
Okay, so I mean, again, she admits there. She says, yes, when Russia uses these, that could potentially be considered a war crime. I agree. So why does that make it okay when now, a couple months or a year later, the Biden administration decides, no, it's actually okay when we use these same exact types of munitions? And again, this has nothing to do with, like, being against Ukrainian forces defending their territory or whatever the fuck. This is about innocent civilians that will presumably inevitably be harmed by these types of munitions, right? This is not a, some sort of like a net positive here where we can conclusively say, okay, these are only going to be used against Russian tanks or, Russian positions on the front line. We don't know. This has tangential consequences into the future. And so, sort of like backing up that point here, I think we had a great article in Jacobin by Branko here where he says, littering Ukraine with cluster bombs is not solidarity. So just to highlight some of the reasons that he fleshes out here, he says, fresh off the decision to litter eastern Ukraine with toxic depleted uranium uranium rounds, which is something I didn't even get to talk about on this channel, but yes, that is something that they decided to do, is sent over depleted uranium rounds, which just as a reminder, I mean, this is similar to what we did in Fallujah, Iraq during that invasion, and even like in recent history, like to this day, Fallujah has such high rates of birth defects amongst some of their young newborn children that are even like in some comparisons worse than the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki back during World War II when we dropped nuclear bombs on those areas, right? They have higher rates of birth defects as a result of these depleted rounds, and it appears like they've okayed those as well. So that in and of itself also probably not a great idea, right? But they say the Biden administration has just okayed another god-awful idea that we're told is meant to benefit ordinary Ukrainians, the supply and use of these cluster bombs. They say there's a reason why 123 countries, including 70% of Washington's NATO allies and aspiring member state Sweden, have signed on to this convention banning these cluster munitions, and why even U.S. law effectively bans the U.S. government from providing or producing them. They are dreadful, mangling things that kill and maim children and other innocents for decades and decades after the fighting has ended. They say cluster munitions are one of those inventions so diabolical that it makes you have a second thought about whether the development of human intelligence was really a good idea. A shell that splits midair into hundreds and even thousands of smaller explosives that fan out across an area as large as several football fields to explode upon landing, and whose high dud rate ensures that if they don't kill or disfigure anyone when they're first fired, they will do so years later when someone happens to be unlucky enough to stumble across them. They're still killing and wounding in Laos, where millions of unexploded cluster bombs are left over from the U.S. war in Vietnam, and where 75% of the victims are kids. Let me say that one more time. 75% of the victims are children. They say in Kosovo, where they were also used by NATO forces, victims were nearly 5 times more likely to be under 14 years old. 5 times more likely to be under 14 years old. 40% of cluster munition casualties were likewise children in Syria, which accounted for 80% of the more than 4,000 casualties from the ordinance recorded from 2010 to 2019. And they say, and when they are not exploding in the faces of innocent children, they're killing U.S. troops themselves, both in the countries that they have been deployed to fight in and back home around military firing ranges. And obviously that would apply similarly to Ukrainian troops as well. But he continues, he says, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan echoed this claim, assuring reporters that, quote, and this is the assurance, this is the defense that they're giving, saying Ukraine has provided written assurances that it is going to use these in a very careful way to minimize risks of civilians. Okay, so again, I mean, sure, right? Again, we're not saying that Ukraine is going to directly strike their own civilian populations, right? Nobody is saying that. The problem is that when you use these and they have such a high dud rate and you use these out in these battlefields that people are going to return to in the future, hopefully, unless this war just continues on into infinity, right? People are going to return to those areas and there is going to be a threat to their lives, to their health, to their safety, right? That's the problem. Saying like, we're going to be very careful about it is basically meaningless, right? There's a reason why the vast majority of NATO allies, there's a reason why, you know, over 120 countries around the world have banned cluster munitions. And it's for that reason, okay? It's going to harm innocent civilians in the future. But they're just sort of like casting that aside now, again, after criticizing Russia for using these same exact types of munitions and calling them war criminals for doing so, which I think was an accurate description. But they say Ukrainian forces have already shown a willingness to use cluster munitions in a way that puts civilians at risk. They say Human Rights Watch, which has copiously documented and condemned Russian forces' uses of these same cluster munitions throughout this war, has compiled numerous instances of Ukrainian forces harming civilians in the country's eastern regions, both during the war and prior to it when Kyiv was fighting a civil war against the separatist-controlled Donbass region. So has the New York Times when it investigated a March attack on what was then the Russian-controlled village of Husar and concluded Ukrainian troops almost certainly fired a cluster rocket into a rural neighborhood. They say written assurances mean little. Meanwhile, when the Ukrainian leadership has already repeatedly violated its pledges to the United States, we already knew that Washington was, in private, not happy about the attacks that Kyiv has staged within Russian borders and on the territory that Moscow considers its soil, including the Kerch Bridge suicide bombing and, at least according to Western intelligence, like Germany, for example, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. But recent reporting from Newsweek's William Arkin illustrates just how fraught the situation is, painting a Washington unable to rein in a more risk-inclined Ukrainian leadership, which obviously, like, on the one hand is like somewhat understandable, right? If my country was also being invaded in the way that Ukraine is, I would probably be willing to use a number of different tactics. I wouldn't go so far as to putting like civilian lives at risk in this type of a circumstance, but like you kind of understand why Ukraine would want to use a maximalist approach to this war. They don't want to have to give up territory, right? They don't want to be subjugated by Russian forces. Some of that is obviously understandable, but at the same time, you have to separate that from the sort of calculus that we are doing as Americans and as the, global superpower when we are fighting essentially what is a proxy war against the, most heavily armed nuclear power in the entire world, which is the Russians, right? We have a different calculus within this war than the Ukrainians do. And again, some of those calculations that they are making are somewhat, somewhat understandable, right? But they say with one military official declaring that it was clear that Zelensky either didn't have complete control over his military or didn't want to know of some of these certain actions that they were just referencing here. And they go on to point out that basically we have a heavy CIA presence within Ukraine that is, sort of observing the situation or giving them some advice or is involved in one way or another. Obviously, not the biggest fan of the CIA over here, but even the CIA, and this is the kind of like the most ironic part of this, even the CIA apparently knows more about what Russia is thinking about this ongoing war effort than we do even about the Ukrainians, which is the side that we are backing, right? And part of that is due to the Cold War and the United States sort of having like this massive intelligence apparatus geared towards countering Russian influence and all of that good stuff. We don't have the same thing set up with Ukraine, but at the same time, it's like this is our ally, right? This is our supposed ally in this war effort, and we don't even know exactly what they are doing. We don't know, if they were, 100% responsible for the Nord Stream pipeline, which is the bombing of civilian infrastructure of a fellow NATO ally, which is completely fucking insane. I mean, Ukraine has, again, this is part of this different calculus that they have versus what the US has. Ukraine has every added benefit in their minds in terms of trying to drag NATO into this war and have a direct confrontation in that way, or to drag the United States more directly and firmly into this war. This is why they called for a no-fly zone. This is why they have pushed all of these other escalatory steps. They do want us because they potentially think that might be their only way to secure what they think should be their justified borders, right? But that is a separate calculation from what we should have here in the United States in trying to avoid a potential direct confrontation with another nuclear armed superpower. So we did have some critiques of this decision from the Biden administration. We had one here from Cornell West. He says, let us be clear, cluster bombs are crimes against humanity. They disproportionately kill children and innocent people far long after that they are dropped. Shame on President Biden for such revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, and I 100% agree with him on that. We also had a statement here from Rashida Tlaib. She says, cluster bombs that the U.S. dropped on Vietnam are still killing civilians to this day. Nearly 125 countries, again, have banned their use. We should not be sending them to Ukraine. The U.S. needs to join this international community in banning their use and destroy our stockpile. Again, 100% correct. And we also had apparently some moves that are being made within Congress itself, led by Ilhan Omar and Jacobs, to introduce some sort of an amendment to prohibit the U.S. transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine or to any other country on the face of the planet. So, I mean, again, obviously, I'm against this move. It's one thing to say you support Ukrainians defending their territory. Obviously, I'm not in favor of the invasion by Vladimir Putin. I do think he's a war criminal. I do think he's a violent freak. But at the same time, we have to have a calculation here where you're looking out for the Ukrainians' interests and what is in the best interest of, average Ukrainian civilians who are being caught up in this war effort. Obviously, you feel for them. And you also have to take into consideration, obviously, the geopolitical context of this ongoing invasion and what is the best path forward towards peace, which is inevitably the way that this war is going to have to end. As I've been saying since the beginning of this invasion, you're going to have to end up with some sort of a negotiated settlement that probably Russia's not going to be entirely happy with, Ukraine is not going to be entirely happy with, and certainly the United States is not going to be entirely happy with. But at the end of the day, there's only a couple ways that this war can end, either with the complete and utter destruction of Ukraine or, a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia, which would would also be an absolute disaster, or it's going to have to end in some sort of a negotiated settlement. And so that is what we should be pushing for, actually trying to bring about some sort of an end to this war instead of just perpetuating this and continuing to send arms with no actual process towards trying to get us towards a peaceful resolution. And, it just doesn't seem like there's any energy for that. I mean, as of right now, I've seen some predictions from the U.S. military saying, casually, oh, this war is going to likely end up going for another year or another couple of years, and we don't see an end to this. I mean, that is something that is obviously, on the one hand, you're going to have people who are like very pro Ukraine and very pro NATO, and they're going to come out and say not 1 inch of Ukrainian territory, or we shouldn't give up this or that. But in the meantime, I mean, Ukrainians are being killed, Russians are being killed, people are being killed on all sides of this war that is just completely unnecessary. I mean, at the end of the day, obviously Russia's responsible for this invasion, but at the same time, innocent men, women, and children are dying and being maimed on a daily basis, and so that is a reality we should be striving to avoid. And so peace is the only way forward, and that is what the Biden administration should be trying to lean much more heavily on, instead of trying to participate in what they themselves sort of admit could potentially be classified as war crimes.
Everyone is saying GoodPoliticGuy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying